Welcome one and all. Thank you for once again filling Humanities 202, and for all of those who will be on via remote and on Adobe Connect. I have it on fairly good authority, although given the way Russians are, we might not see them shadow presence on Adobe Connect. I've been told there might be some Russians attending today with us remotely, and if that is so, we have given a special heartfelt appreciative welcome to them, especially given, depending on where exactly they are in Russia, at the earliest it will be 9 p.m. for them. So I'm appreciative of that commitment. Before we really get started, give me a chance to sort of give an excited foreshadowing for the next ISIS Open Forum, our third, which is 4 weeks from today on December 3rd, which will be entitled Fighting Patient Zero, Ebola, Partisan Politics, and National Security. We have something in the works for that that's a bit of a surprise. We don't have it done and set just yet, but I'm just excited for that event. We'll have a little twist on things, so I hope you look forward to that as well. And contrary to rumor, Dr. Watson has convinced me the surprise should not be getting a live Ebola strain into the classroom for all of us to look at. But today we're here to talk about itching to be enemies, Obama, Putin, and a new Cold War. Our format is we'll begin with Dr. Darius Watson of the ISIS program, giving us a brief PowerPoint presentation that will cover NATO positions and concerns and considerations, and also some key questions for all of us to consider, many of which are in the pamphlets that you see before you. That will be followed by an even briefer sort of role-play presentation by yours truly, which I will be Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov of the Russian Federation. I give you two promises for this role-play. The first promise is that every single word I say will be either a direct quote verbatim or a very carefully, closely paraphrased quote from either Minister Lavrov or President Vladimir Putin himself. Some of these quotes are actually extremely recent, as in less than 72 hours ago. So hopefully you'll find that interesting. I found it pretty fascinating. My second promise is a bit more lighthearted, but that is I will try my best to not trot out my fake Russian accent. Because even if in my mind I feel I'm even better than, say, Robin Williams in the film Moscow on the Hudson, in reality I fear it comes off more like Boris from the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoon. And where I think probably both of those references have horrifically dated me. If you know those references, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Darius Watson.
I actually was just happy not to see a big fur hat and a bottle of vodka on the table. So
I was tempted.
I think we're already ahead of the curve here with regards to the role play. So what it is we're here to talk about, and you should know as kind of an insider here, I would probably be willing to bet that one of the things that Dr. Crosston and I have the most vigorous discussion over is the title of these things. And so one of the things that we kind of discussed with regards to this title is whether or not it should have a question mark. So I should say up front that as much as we're asking the question here of whether or not there is a new Cold War developing between Russia and the United States, I am very much on the no side. And I should probably state that up front. And I think there are going to be various pieces of information and arguments and discussion that go back and forth that perhaps contradict some of the things I argue or maybe confirm them, but hopefully we're going to get you all involved in this conversation so that we can kind of get a more groundswell or basic understanding of how we all feel about it. I don't think the word containment should be new to anyone, especially anyone that has a memory or recollection of the Cold War. Containment in many ways was the primary policy of the United States with regards to dealing with the Soviet Union and the relationship they had during that period. One of the arguments I'm going to be throwing out here, or that we're going to be discussing, is that fundamentally the United States is still on some level engaging in containment. I think one of the interesting aspects of this is that if you ask American foreign policy personnel, they wouldn't use that term. However, I think as we will hear, I think the Russians very much view certain activities and policies on the part of the United States as still being reminiscent of old world or old school containment policy. So one of the interesting things, for instance, that we need to understand is that during the Cold War, there was also a mixture of containment and engagement with regards to the relationship between the two countries. So in the post-Cold War period, we see that continued through programs such as, for instance, the Partnership for Peace, which is a military cooperation program sponsored by NATO, and its intention was to help non-NATO countries, specifically former Soviet republics, become much more acquainted with the security apparatus within the European system. And its more general goal was to develop understanding and openness with regards to the exchange of information, because much of what kind of dictated the nature of the Cold War was a lack of understanding, a lack of clear knowledge of what the other side was doing or what their intentions were. The New START agreement that some of you may or may not be familiar with is the most recent nuclear arms control agreement signed between Russia and the United States. It represented a rather significant reduction of nuclear weapons in general on both sides, and I would argue it also represented a reduction of the role of nuclear weapons in our understanding of the U.S.-Russia relationship in general. In other words, if we understand nuclear weapons to be a significant component of the Cold War, one of my arguments is it just isn't the same now. And so that's one of the ways in which I would come to the conclusion we're not heading towards the same sort of Cold War situation. The flip side of that is kind of poking the bear. And I think the United States is very good at doing that and then pretending that we don't. You cannot overlook the perceptions of Russia since the end of the Cold War with regards to NATO expansion. As far as Russia is concerned, that is in many ways the primary issue or threat, if you will. And if there's anything that I would find it hard to argue as a kind of a new Cold War characteristic, it would be the tendency of the EU and NATO in particular to sometimes poke the bear. Couple of things that I think really bear mentioning here with regards to understanding the Cold War versus the situation we're in now. First and foremost, although I didn't believe it at the time, it was a widely held understanding that the Russians had significant conventional weapons and military advantages over the United States. And that part of the Cold War balance was bent on U.S. nuclear and strategic capabilities balancing Soviet conventional capabilities. I would argue that Soviet conventional military advantage is gone. And I would actually go as far as to say it never existed, but that's a whole other classic conversation. You'll note here just some basic numbers. Okay, the United States has almost 50% more active personnel right now. Okay, while our tanks are about half of what the Russians have, our tanks are also some of the best in the world. So I think there's qualitative issues that don't necessarily come across when you're just doing a straight number comparison. For those of you that may or may not be remember these things, the classic bomber gap and missile gap of the Cold War, there's a gap, all right, but it's not detrimental to us any longer. I'd like to point out one of the keys for my understanding of geopolitics and the nature of the Cold War and the relationship between the United States and Russia is the idea of projection of power. The fundamental reason why I never gave Russia the same credit during the Cold War as many other U.S. observers did is because I never saw Russia having the same ability to project power as the United States. Simply put, the United States currently has 11 aircraft carrier fleets. Russia has 1. And that's not a ratio that's much different than it was during the Cold War. And when you add in that qualitative and technological difference, you know, I just don't see it as being an issue in the same way it was during the original Cold War. Nuclear taboo, I've already mentioned, the New START program. There are a variety of other things that have taken place since the 1980s that, again, in my opinion, have reduced the overall importance of nuclear weapons as a critical understanding of the potential war between Russia and the United States. They're still there, and I'm not pretending they're not, but I think the steps that we all rationally and logically consider to be steps that would have to take place for a nuclear war to happen are much bigger. We're not going to see another Cuban Missile Crisis type event, in my opinion. I could be wrong. And finally, the pivot to Asia, I think you'd have to put that under the poking the bear a little bit, although obviously from an explicit point, much of that pivot is based upon China. But I think to a degree, again, the United States is trying to arrange allies around the world, whether it's for a future rise of China or a reemergence of Russia. So my argument here is that Russia is essentially the most important pariah state. And you know, again, some people are going to disagree, and that's why this is going to be such a good event, but I would argue that Russia in many ways has engaged in behaviors and policies that fundamentally contradict what the United States sees as appropriate behavior in the international community. Whether it's what's often referred to as democratic backsliding based upon primarily Russian presidentialism and political corruption, or the degree to which Russia is often seen as meddling in the politics of their regional neighbors, see Ukraine. I think there is a growing kind of disdain on the part of the West relative to what they perceive as the way Russia should be behaving as a major actor in the international system. I think this perception is borne out again when we look at the human rights record. Russian support of Assad and by association Syria has been well documented. And regardless again of what we're talking about from a geopolitical perspective, the world is different today. I don't think I'm telling anybody here anything they don't already know when I tell you human rights was about 7th on the list of the top 5 priorities during the Cold War of either side. It was something we gave lip service to, but it certainly wasn't going to be a reason that we were going to directly confront the Soviet Union, for instance. I would argue that's changed to a degree. The domestic suppression of opposition, that's another issue that I think the West often has with regards to Russia and their policies. Whether it's the Assad, this is a really interesting picture. They're not arresting these protesters, they're just making sure to videotape everybody's faces so that they know who you are and when you were there and what you participated in. And I thought that was kind of the sort of thing that we in the West look at as proof, if you will, that they're not advancing the way we'd like them to with regards to democratic and human rights principles. Finally, there's some international economic issues. I think the ledger is not complete when it comes to the ultimate impact of the economic reforms that have been taking place in Russia since the end of the Cold War, but also clearly there continue to be significant problems with regards to the Russian economy, especially as it relates to connections to, for instance, the EU or broader international markets. One of those connections being Russian energy policy. There continues to this day to be significant grumblings, for instance, over the degree to which the Russian government protects and/or is beholden to Gazprom, which is the primary natural gas and petroleum developer in Russia. It's these sorts of connections that, again, I think cause the West to often look at Russia as a potential pariah state. That's my phrase. I don't think that's a word you're going to find in foreign policy lexicon, but at the same time, I would argue that these questions up here, these comments up here, at least lead us to question how legitimate and how proper the Russian behavior is and foreign policy is in the world today. So we have these questions to consider. What is the impact of using the Cold War to understand current U.S.-Russia relations? I would argue that we're not doing ourselves a justice by utilizing old understandings and phrases and concepts to understand this new world. So, for instance, one of the things that I believe is fundamentally different is I do not think Russia encapsulates a threatening ideology in the same way that the Soviet Union did. I think this fundamentally changes the degree to which we view them as a threat. Second question, how important are the personalities to the understanding? And we're going to get a very clear demonstration of the personalities. And to be clear, this is not just a Putin bashing here. I think very clearly Obama's personality has directly affected the evolution of the relationship with Russia as well. And so I think it's important to understand not just the individual personalities and perspectives here, but the way in which they're interacting. Because I think there have been times when both have been unwilling to compromise or back down from a position just because of ego or whatever else, and not necessarily because of a particular interest being served. How does China and EU impact U.S.-Russia relations? We're going to talk about that quite a bit. I think indications are lately that that Russia seems to be turning to China to a degree in terms of, especially with regards to the newly signed natural gas agreement that they signed, so that Russia will now be giving China natural gas. They'll be the primary recipient of natural gas until the year 2020. I believe it starts in 2016. That was an agreement that's directly signed to take the pressure off of Russia that's coming from the sanctions on their energy sector as a part of the Ukraine issue. Finally, is this the beginning of a long-term decline in U.S.-Russia relations? To me, this is the question that we're all here to answer. And I thank you all for coming to help us answer that, and hope you enjoy the rest of the presentation.
I find it interesting that we supposedly want to move away from Cold War rhetoric and terminology, but we start this off by being called a pariah state. I will begin actually with a direct quote from our president, Vladimir Putin, just speaking last week. He said that the United States declared itself the victor in the Cold War and decided to divide the whole world as it sees fit, and then simply made a mess of international relations. The impression is that the so-called the so-called victors in the Cold War, decided to press that situation further, cut up the whole world entirely for yourself, for your own interests, and if the current system of international relations, international, mind you, the system of checks and balances stood in its way, in your way, these would immediately be declared useless, obsolete, subject to immediate demolition. And we have experience with this already in Russia. We have this because this is exactly how the nouveau riche in our country behave. The people who suddenly found themselves in possession of enormous wealth and great power, but instead of disposing that competently and neatly, including in their own favor, we're not denying you the opportunity to pursue your own interests. But instead of pursuing your own interests and understanding it is encapsulated within a larger system, you've just really cocked it all up. The Cold War ended, it did indeed, but it didn't end in peace. And for us, peace is clear and lucid agreements about new rules and standards. Having declared yourselves the victor in the Cold War, you have arrogantly assumed there was no need for these rules and new standards. Instead of establishing a new balance of power, and make no mistake, that is a necessary condition to us of order and stability, a balance of power. You have instead taken steps which lead to a sharp aggravation of imbalance. Those are the words of President Vladimir Putin. I'd like to add to that a couple of other things that actually capitalize off of the presentation you just saw. Let's add to this your utterly ridiculous proposal not long ago of a missile shield, a missile shield to protect Western Europe against Iran that was conveniently put in the Czech Republic and Poland, right next to us. Let us consider your blind passion to sort of cravenly remove Bashar al-Assad from Syria without even trying to figure out who are these rebels that you supposedly want to remove Assad from Syria. Rebels that would become a major element in something else today that you call the Islamic State and is quite frankly screwing with you horribly. That did not come from our involvement in Syria. That came from your involvement in Iraq. Let us consider your failure to work with our intelligence agencies despite numerous attempts on our part regarding the Tsarnaev brothers, only to have that literally blow up in your faces in the Boston Marathon. And then finally, most recently, how you constantly portray events in Crimea and eastern Ukraine as simply some Russian trick to try to reestablish Soviet power across Eastern Europe. I have heard, and this is me speaking now, Sergei Lavrov, I've heard many times that Russia is becoming a raw materials colony of China. And so I have a question for you, Americans. Is Russia not already a raw materials appendage of the European Union? And if we are a raw materials appendage of the EU, why can't we also become a raw materials province of China? Why does Saudi Arabia, which is a raw materials province of the entire world, prosper with very little interference in its affairs? But we cannot do the same. All the more so the situation in Ukraine has shown us, Russians, vividly, it is illustrated vividly to us that delivering raw materials in only one direction, the direction that you want, doesn't really serve our interests all that well or keep us very safe or protected. And I'll wrap it up now with a quote that I found in numerous sources that are both journalist sources and scholarly sources. And I think given the presentation you just saw, I think you can find it believable that this is true. And I quote, "It is up to the West to ask a question. Which Russia do we want? Do we want to have a strong or a weak Russia? a Russia integrated into the international system, or one that is kept outside. Whatever action the West decides to take, it has to keep in mind that Russia, conforming to highly traditional modes of great power behavior, will most likely react with counter-pressure and nationalistic rhetoric if cornered. Unquote. To me, what is just as amazing is how Americans miss the real point of that quote, which is that just the mere boldness in your thinking that you can even ask that question demands a necessary counter from the Russian state. What type of Russia do you want to have? Whether you allow it in the system or not. In what capacity is it allowed in the system? You are the only country that asks these questions, and I tell you freely, no state in the global system would allow any other country to talk to it in this matter. So you pursue your interests, we pursue our interests. If you have a problem with that, we have a problem with you. That's all. All right, now, and scene. Now we just open it up to comments, commentary, questions, whatever you may wish. The open forum is meant to be truly open for your benefit, so please, by all means, fire away.
Someone ask a question before he does jazz hands.
I'll get up on this table and tap. Right here and then John.
With regard to the situation in the Ukraine, it's never been quite clear to me what exactly the objective of Russia is in the Ukraine, other than beachfront property, and you know, I suppose a warm
is that so bad?
I can relate to that. You know, and a warm weather naval port. What do you see as them trying to accomplish in that area right now?
Okay. Darius, you want to start with that? Because I think we have different opinions on that. I have a different focus, is probably what I should say.
I mean, I think that they had true kind of material interests served in Crimea. And my own opinion is that Crimea went so astoundingly well for them that they figured, why not see if we can continue this on into Ukraine. My own argument is that I think beyond this kind of territorial, we want Russians to be part of Russia rhetoric, I'll be honest, I'm hard-pressed to say that there was some sort of specific key state-level interest being served by the operations in Ukraine. Again, Crimea is much different issue from a historical perspective, from a military perspective. Ukraine, to me, seems much more like a political play.
I need to start to answer that question. I have to start from the beginning. And to Russians, the beginning is actually the Maidan revolution, which has almost sort of become not part of the conversation anymore, which is odd simply because it is where the whole conversation begins for the Russian Federation. Now, as we recall, the Maidan revolution takes place, and the president of Ukraine still denies this fact, but fled. Said, I don't trust the way this is going, so I'm out of here. I'll go over to southern Russia and be safe. And at that point, there was one really crucial mistake made by the new Ukrainian government, for lack of a better term. They, I think, quite frankly, and I've written about this, exclusively, that they sort of felt what I call sort of like a continued epiphany and a continued euphoria from the Arab Spring, which is that if we kick out the bad guy, in this case the bad guy has to be our president, then, just so people in the back, everyone will support us. Because, the president of Ukraine was not a great guy. No one thought of him as a huge Democrat or an incredibly powerful person or moving person. So if we kick him out, obviously everyone's going to get on board and get behind that. Unlike the Arab Spring, and we've talked about this extensively, the one huge mistake they made in Kiev, in the capital, was that there's this giant right next door that signed an awful lot of agreements with that president who fled. Commercial agreements, trade agreements, natural resources agreements, military agreements. It's very important, not just in symbolic terms, but also in terms of what the Russians consider to be their strategic regional interests in that area. And when they went and sort of did little quiet ventures to say, well, what about the new Ukrainian government? Okay, the president's gone. Are you going to honor all these agreements that we've signed? And they're like, well, we don't really know yet. We're not going to commit. Now, there was no one in the Arab Spring to be able to then say, well, all right, you don't want to commit, fine. Then let us show you why you should commit. And what Dr. Watson said is true. Crimea went, it's not so much that how well Crimea went. It's that it went exactly the way Russia would want it to go, with very little effort on Russia's part. Right? And then Russia's there, intimidating, no doubt. Just being on the doorstep is an intimidating factor. But they didn't have to go en masse and take that physically by force. It just went over. The referendum that no one in the West wants to agree with took place, and the results were overwhelmingly in favor of that quote-unquote secession, or accession back to the Russian Federation, whatever way you want to term it. Very little effort and energy on the part of the Russian Federation. So I'll stop there in the sense of Russia's play. It was not about trying to get Crimea because it needs better beachfront property, or it wants to not have to worry about renting the naval base anymore. Didn't care. It had already signed it. It just signed an agreement about the renting the base just before the Maidan Revolution. And gaining parts of eastern Ukraine, we'll get more into it I'm sure later, is so ridiculous, but I'll hold off on that for now. I'll explain a little bit why. I think it's more about the deals that were already set in place, important, what they consider to be geopolitical deals that were in their best interests, and when the sides that overthrew the government said, we're not giving you any promises and we might renege on everything that he did before we got here, they're like, all right, then if that's the way you want to play, we can play as well.
I would add to that,
harder.
Timing was, because it wasn't just, we're not sure if we're going to keep the agreements, we'll get back to you. At the same exact time, the new Ukrainian government is also both giving and receiving overtures to the EU and NATO that suddenly put Russia on alert in terms of, okay, it's one thing for this country to be going through this turmoil and, change the political hands, and are we going to keep... It's a whole nother issue for them to suddenly begin moving closer to Western Europe. That's something that wasn't going to be allowed. I would argue, regardless of how aggressively the new Ukrainian government resisted Russian influence or not, I think it would have gone differently. And this is that poking the bear. I think it would have gone differently had the EU and NATO not immediately tried to take advantage of that opportunity to create closer ties with that new Ukrainian government.
What's funny is that this is actually gives a great illustration of the tete-a-tete that both sides throw at each other. Because we hear in the West, it was in Dr. Watson's presentation itself, that Russia is messing around in Ukraine. But what Dr. Watson just said is clearly viewed by Russians as United States is messing around in Ukraine. Which is why we are now going to step in that direction. So then it becomes, I don't want to be cliche about chicken and egg kind of thing, but these high-minded, well-experienced diplomats on both sides end up sort of throwing chicken and egg conversations at each other back and forth about who exactly was stepping where into what. Because there are plenty of diplomats in foreign, especially in the intelligence services in Russia, that would tell you, no way Maidan even happens without some early overtures to begin with from the EU about this is where you want to go. And then sustaining that revolutionary push. So they're saying, so if we want to just go simply chronologically, you started it, so don't be mad at us if we're going to finish it, kind of thing. John, you had your hand up before.
You mentioned personalities, and when Lavrov was speaking, I kept hearing
Matt Crosston.
from the American side the personality of W. And it occurs to me that Yeltsin's disappearance and Putin's rise and W being in office are relatively contemporary events. And the attitude of the Americans that you described from Lavrov's point of view seems to be very, very much W's attitude. Would that be a correct perception?
I think they go broader than that because I don't think Russians necessarily have any overt love or reminiscence or nostalgia about George W. Bush.
I wouldn't think so.
Although, on the other hand, Putin has always been famous for saying he didn't mind the personality of Bush because he felt like you pretty much could figure out where he stood and he didn't really hide it. So he put his cards out on the table, and they valued that at least, whether they agreed with those cards or not. I think a more accurate aspect of that actually is that, and I've done this in a conference before, where just like you want to hear like a lively debate turn into like crickets because you've said something people don't like. I had that awkward moment last year, which is where it's not that the Russians are sort of personality-wise mimicking Bush. The Russians are just standing very firmly on the idea that we're doing nothing that is not what you do. What we don't accede to, what we don't acquiesce to, is the idea that only you get to do it, talking to the United States, is that we have no problem with what the United States does. We see time and again and reach our hand out for opportunities to work with the United States where there could be joint interests, but where there aren't joint interests, we naturally have to diverge because that's the nature of international relations. A problem we have is that the problem that the Russians have tends to be the sense that America likes to stand up at the podium and say either only they get to do it because there's some greater moral purpose or cause behind their foreign policy actions that others should agree with, or they have a greater advantage in terms of just pure unmitigated power, like some of those quotes that Lavrov said about being, sort of like getting a little drunk happy with being the victor of the Cold War. I feel like so many Russians sort of like, that Cold War thing ended a generation ago. I think it's time you put that to bed.
It seems to me, though, what you're describing right now is the position of W. That these are feelings or attitudes that he pretty clearly expressed.
I would argue that Putin and GW,
George Washington.
I think that ultimately, I don't think it's a matter of their own individual perceptions and personalities. I think it's more the degree to which, and this is something I want to get back to from the original presentation Dr. Crosston made, I think it's the degree to which both of them still very much use both the approach and the vernacular associated with Cold War statesmanship. And I think that, to a degree, is why we saw the relationships developing between them, is because George Bush was not the first one to go, you're with us or against us. That was born in the earliest stages of the 1950s when we were developing the Cold War mentality. And so to me, the reason why we find echoes, if you will, of the Cold War and Bush's policies is because as a state, as a foreign policy mechanism, we're not just going to do away with those understandings. Something that was said specifically, the concept, traditional modes of state behavior. I think, to me, this is the core. I think Russia looks at the United States and says, you're still engaging in traditional modes of state behavior. You get involved in a state because your interests are at play. Human rights are secondary, ethics are secondary. It's about the interests of the state being served. That's traditional. We all know that's how the game's played. That's what we're playing too, so don't pretend that somehow we're not playing the same game. And I think right now what we're seeing, or at least over the last decade or so, is the reaction of the United States saying, the game's not the same. We're not playing by the same rules. See the rise of the non-state actor. See the rise of multipolarity. In other words, you're accusing us of certain behaviors, but we really are promoting democracy more. We're not just promoting democracy to stop the spread of communism. Now, the rhetoric and the reality, again, are different issues. But in terms of the rhetoric, I would argue that's the basis of our kind of, turning our nose up, if you will, at Russian foreign policy, because while I think they are engaging in traditional state behavior, I think the U.S. foreign policy establishment believes that the world is no longer made for traditional state behavior. My own opinion is the only reason we believe that is because we're the dominant state. And so we think, by definition, everything we do is ethically and morally untouchable. But that's every hegemon in the history of the world has thought that way. So again, I don't ascribe necessarily particular cultural aspects to this. I think it's the echoes of the Cold War. I really do.
Can I say that there's just and we'll come to you right now. A 21st century, though, complaint, because this is what frustrates Russians quite a bit, is because they find their counterparts in America always falling back on that. It's like you're trying to put an image upon us that we don't necessarily ascribe to. George W. Bush is, you're either with us or against us following 9/11, right? Who was the first person who called Bush? The first person.
Sure.
It was Putin. Not Canada, not UK, not Australia. Putin was the first person who called Bush. Because Putin, quite frankly, now he won't put it in these terms, but he was excited. He was horrified by 9/11, but excited about what he thought it would mean in terms of American-Russian relations. He said, absolutely, George W., you're either with you or against you. We're with you. And George W.'s like, maybe not you. You know, I'm not sure we want you to be with us.
See Chechnya.
So, you know, and this is why Putin was so excited. Putin's like, we've been fighting this stuff for the last 10 years in Chechnya. And you've sort of ignorantly clarified it as a revolutionary movement in our borders that we're putting down oppressively. But what you just experienced in 9/11 is what we've been experiencing for 10 years almost. Now you understand. Now you'll see the light. And the United States did not. Not in terms of any kind of new relationship with the Russians. So to the Russians, that has nothing to do with them adhering to Cold War images, but rather them being unable to break through an American mindset of wanting Russia to always be the Cold War rival,
Well,
regardless of affairs on the ground.
That's the point I was trying to make, though, that it was that particular, almost neocon outlook.
Question?
I have a sort of a philosophical question.
Ooh, I like
Because
those.
of Peter the Great, you had 7 segments of Russian political society who had this supposed sense of inferiority, and they embarked upon this great westernization, the culture, the language, the technology. That's been ongoing for a couple hundred years. Does that exist today in Russia in any segment, and how does it affect their attitude toward the West?
I guess I'll take that question. That's more in my wheelhouse. It's when people try to ask me or try to understand why I love that region of the world so much. It's just because the people are so fascinating, because there is a long historical Russian philosophical tradition, not just that is both. I've always said Russia is the only country that will say in one sentence with complete seriousness, and they don't think it's contradictory, that clearly God hates them, therefore God has a special mission for them. They are both messianically blessed and clearly hated by the Lord and Savior above at the same time. And they're the only people I've ever come across in all my travels that believe that completely the same way with a completely equal passion. And therefore they get this horrible critique of themselves. We're backwards, we have to look west, Peter the Great, everything else, because we can't rely. Even like Lenin was very disturbed about, what do I have to work with here? Like I pull this revolution off, and he's like, oh, this is all I have to work with? Like 98% illiterate, the turn of the century kind of thing. How is this going to work out? So then they create all these little new tools like Vanguard of the Proletariat and everything else. So, but I just caution you at the same time that the farther you go back, as sympathetic as I am to philosophy and historical culture and things like that, there's still something in play to me in terms of contemporary geopolitics and intelligence operations and diplomatic affairs where, yeah, all right, it's sort of a residue in the back of all of our minds. But don't try to determine everything based off of, like, well, this is why person X did Y and why person Z did A, because he's American and she's Russian, and they have no choice but to go in that direction because, Peter the Great back in, the 1860s, no. I'm always very skeptical about how far we take that, because sometimes in our scholarship we take that a bit far. And I just think sometimes if we were a little bit more pragmatic in the way we look at everyday thinking as far as how people, where the offense can happen. Like the offense is happening plenty in contemporary settings. We don't have to go back to some misunderstanding during Peter the Great's time to figure out why Russians just can't have an issue, can't make peace with America, or why America can't look at Russia in a new way or a new light. I think that's a failure of modern thinking rather than old culture.
I would just add, from the Western perspective, and again, I'm not a Russian historian or a political analyst. I am, however, heavily involved in military development, military policy, and politics in the European system. And as much as I don't think the Europeans go back to Peter the Great, I guess one of the arguments I'm throwing out here is they still very much go back to the Cold War period in terms of, okay, so the behaviors of Putin today with regards to, for instance, the Eurasian Union might not date back to Russian insecurities from the 16th and 17th century. That said, in the minds of the West, it's still a clear indication that there's some sort of cultural or political insecurity there. How are we going to deal with it? And so that to me is the dynamic that still kind of brings the history in.
There's a hand up in the back before.
Yeah, there's
The question is, with the incursions against Ukraine, what is the opinion of how the U.S. handled the response? Does the Budapest Memorandum play any part?
I just think that is, we've sort of actually touched upon this already a little bit. That's part of the debate that's still ongoing, in the sense of, I found it interesting, there's a real sharp dichotomy actually between what conversations are taking place behind the scenes diplomatically versus the stories we might read across various news agencies and organizations, whether they be American or Russian or in the middle with the EU. I've heard so much, there's so much negotiation taking place behind the scenes that really doesn't make the papers. And yet what we read in the paper, quote unquote papers, virtually whatever, tends to be emphasizing the conflict. So this has been one of the weirdest conflicts to me in the sense of just how much talking is taking place and how no one pays any attention to it. They emphasize the badness of the conflict on the ground.
I sometimes wonder if the media, again, like I can't help but compare it to a degree to like something like the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of that proximity issue, the idea that your enemy is now much closer and messing with somebody right next to you. How do you respond? I wonder if part of the, measured response, to be politically correct, that you saw from the West with regards to the Ukraine was at least partially driven by a rather fast progression of events. And it seemed almost like every day something new was happening. I am sure that there were people that were looking around after that, was it the Malaysian air flight? The Malaysian plane that got shot? Literally, I'm sure they had draft policies on the table before that happened that they then had to look at and go, does this even still apply? And so I almost wonder if part of the issue with understanding the response of the West to the Ukraine wasn't just simply due to the way in which and the pace of progression of events in the case, so that they just constantly found themselves going, let's see what happens tomorrow.
Okay, now the question.
There was a lot of reference to George W., but the current administration, really, are they any different in the way they operate?
No, I've actually written about this. I've published about this, and this is actually this piece. Although I won't call it, it certainly wasn't a throwaway piece by any means, but we talked about the true, quotation marks, the true conservatism of Obama foreign policy. I'll let, afterwards you come up to me and I can get you access to that piece. But there's always, the main gist of that piece was simply to argue one of the, to me, what seems to be one of the modern consequences of American foreign policy on American domestic politics is that Democrats are scared to death to do anything innovative whatsoever in foreign policy because they know what is going to come from the other side if they do it. And I can give you the perfect example. It was the only thing I really was intrigued by, given my own interests, in the lead up to the 2008 election when Obama talked about wanting to engage Iran. Does anyone remember that? That we should be able to talk to Iran and things like that? Do you remember the reaction when he said that? It was as if it was quickly portrayed almost as like Obama said, I would like to go over to Iran and sleep with all of its women. It was the same approach. And then suddenly Obama immediately, I didn't really mean that. I just said we should seek as many opportunities as we can, but never forgetting it was awful. It was horrible. And it was definitely, in foreign policy, a sign of things to come. Democrats, my personal opinion is Democrats are horrifically afraid to do anything out of the norm in terms of American historical foreign policy, and American historical foreign policy is conservative. There's no denying it. And so they just are afraid of being labeled with the W card, either weak or wussy. You take your pick. And I think Obama, which obviously never had a foreign policy pedigree to begin with, it was a domestic thing more than anything else, he would obviously fall into. That's the niche where you would go if you don't feel confident about what you're doing. So yeah, I agree completely. There was not a dramatic change for Russian-American relations because of 2008. Yeah, I think that's completely right. There's another hand up.
If I could just real quick, I'm sorry. I have to actually almost completely disagree. And I would argue that, yeah, amazing. We never disagree. Anybody that knows us, we get along splendidly. I would argue that, in fact, it's how you define innovation from a foreign policy perspective. So, for instance, we can argue that Democrats are not innovative with regards to foreign policy if we overlook things like the United Nations. Things like that can't be overlooked, it seems to me. And whether or not we're talking about immediate or broader understandings of foreign policy, I think both sides have both contributed positive and negatively. The thing I would throw out with regards to the differences and similarities between Obama, one place Obama in many ways had to, in my opinion, pick up the policies where they were left off. And it had nothing, in my opinion, to do with partisanship and everything to do with the geostrategic requirements of the war on terror, especially as they involved our involvements in Afghanistan and Iraq at the time. So you can be on the campaign trail all you want talking about getting us out of Iraq in 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, whatever, but when he goes in the Pentagon for that first briefing, I'm sure they told him, this is the reality on the ground. These are the time scales we could potentially give you if you really wanted to withdraw, but here are the consequences. And he, again, Republican, Democrat, in my opinion, it would have mattered. As the President of the United States, he had no choice but to come back and kind of eat some of those words. But again, no matter how much we're disagreeing about the run-up to it, I think the important part is that regardless of the explanation, the outcome's the same.
Sorry, I just want to get more voices. We'll come back.
It's interesting both of you say that and agree and disagree at the same time. But does any of that change as of yesterday? Because you have to address your legacy, as most presidents have always done in this same situation in the past. And you have to find things that you can work with the Republicans to achieve. And one of those things is potentially a different foreign policy. Do you see that, coming about as of, right now?
No!
I'm sorry, I think I just saw a red light go on in the back of the room there.
I wondered coming in today if this would suddenly morph into, about American politics, with everything that happened last night, and maybe towards the end we'll get more into it. I don't actually believe that was a disagreement. So maybe that's my own flexible mind working my magic. Because I just simply believe that, I can grant the points that Dr. Watson made. I still think there is an overarching foreign policy tendency in the United States that has emerged partially, yes, by facts on the ground in the international arena, but also facts on the ground in the domestic arena in terms of domestic politics. And I just know for a fact, and I remember the piece, I took it back to my native Massachusetts in 1988, and Governor Dukakis, where he sat in the tank, if anyone remembers,
Yes.
and looked like a complete, there's just too many swear words I really want to use here right now. Many people would say, in a way, it's like symbolically, image-wise, it lost him the election right there. Trying to look like he was tough by saying, I know how to sit in a tank. And he looked just so foolish that it totally backfired. And so it's almost like the Dukakis effect to me in the Democratic Party is, do not look weird, weak, out of place, awkward, out of position with anything that has to do with the military, technology, foreign policy, or international relations. Well, all right, if I don't want to do that, what do I have to do? Well, then continue with the status quo with the way that we're going directionally. And at that point in time, you're coming off of Reagan and still in the Cold War, and it has a huge impact still to this day. on how we view things from within the Democratic Party. That's my one criticism, foreign policy-wise, of the Democratic Party. Is like, please stop being Republican. So I don't think last night changed that at all, because I don't think that has anything to do with partisan politics in terms of midterm elections, that suddenly they'll all catch fire and want to work together for a new direction in foreign policy.
Yeah, I'm going to leave that. I'm a realist, okay? And so what Dr. Cross is talking about from a theoretical perspective is called the two-level game, the idea that domestic politics involves international politics and vice versa. As a realist, I argue that domestic politics only goes so far. And when a state's interests are threatened, a state will respond. That's just, it kind of doesn't matter who's in charge. To me, and listening to Dr. Cross talk, it actually suddenly occurred to me that some of the insecurities, if you will, amongst Democrats that maybe are perceived today with regards to foreign policy, how different were they with regards to the perception of individuals who wanted to question U.S. policy during, I don't know, the 1960s, right? And so to me, one of the interesting dynamics in this is perhaps it was easier to engage the discussion during the Cold War because our mortal enemy and the threatening ideology were the same thing. Right now, the mortal enemy, be it China or Russia, is fundamentally different than the threatening ideology. And so I'm actually not shocked in the least that we have a foreign policy going all over the place because we're chasing an idea. We always knew where Russia was. We could be more or less aggressive. We could point missiles or not. We half the time don't know where the heck the Islamic State threat is coming from. And so in terms of foreign policy, I wouldn't be surprised to see more meandering, less definitive kind of, let's go do this, simply because we don't know where to go do it.
Yes.
On domestic politics, two questions. Do you think that Obama's domestic weaknesses have encouraged some of Putin's or Russia's aggressiveness? And second part is domestic in Russia. Do you, Dr. Crosston, think that there has been as much nationalist surge as is portrayed in our media, or are everyday Russians just kind of going with the flow of things and not turning more nationalist?
I mean, to your first question, I feel like there's a little Lavrov coming out. Like, we are not aggressive. Stop.
Yeah, we haven't done anything to Obama. He's done it to himself.
Yeah.
That would probably be the response there.
Yeah, I don't think, traditionally speaking, Russian foreign policy has not really, they'd like to at least make overt declarations about we don't really care what happens inside the United States in terms of their domestic affairs, like whether it's Bush being elected and then re-elected and then Obama coming in. They just want to know, what is that person in the executive chair going to do in terms of relations with the Russian Federation? How he got to that point, what issues he might face internally within his own country. They really haven't shown an awful lot of, they have specialists obviously who monitor that and analyze that, but whether that has a direct impact on how they try to formulate their own foreign policy thinking towards the United States, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think anything that happened in Ukraine had nothing to do with them thinking, right now Obama is weak domestically, and he's facing some midterm rejections last night, so let's go do this. I don't think that happened at all. Domestic policy, in terms, domestic popular opinion, I guess is really what that second question was about. I don't find American people all that different from Russian people in my travels, in the sense of just getting along with each other, and they've always been very, very adamant about, listen, whatever the American government does, I don't think it means all the American people believe this way and they think we're a devil and we're horrible people and looking to attack everybody or meddle in everyone else's affairs. They have enough, on their own plates, which is, I think many Americans feel that way about their own government too, is I have plenty on my plate just making sure my life is as great as it can be and my family is as protected as it can be and taken care of. I'm really not that involved in the political affairs of my country abroad. I like to maybe keep, the best ones we can hope for is that we keep aware of situations. But even that, let's face facts, I think there's equally profound complaints about the general foreign policy awareness of Americans and Russians amongst Americans and Russians. So they're not. Especially the deeper out you go, the deeper into the provinces you go, the more parochial it becomes, like the more localized it becomes.
What do you think as far as all this could be more related to a deep down Russian feeling of disrespect by the West towards Russia? I mean, you got the administration saying, let's go ahead and do a reset with Russia, completely tossing out how many years of history between the two. And then you've got our administration saying that Russia is practically a regional power now, despite the fact that it's still a nuclear superpower.
Again, and I'm just going to throw this out there and people can disagree with me. I think Russia has always deluded itself into believing that it was more than just a regional power. They are absolutely a nuclear superpower, and I am not denying that. But I think little things like Russia never deployed troops at any time during the Cold War in any state that did not border Russia directly or one of their satellites. They never had the ability to project conventional power on a global level in the way the United States did. The Cubans sent more troops abroad into direct combat in the name of communism during the Cold War than the Russians did. So, I mean, again, this idea, the rhetoric end of it, in my opinion, again, and he may completely disagree, for my 2 cents, I do believe Russia is offended by the idea that we consider them to be a regional power, but to be perfectly frank, I don't think that's an unrealistic perception of Russia.
I think that almost hits right on the head why Russia gets so pissed off all the time at the United States. Because they just see that as almost, there's like quasi-arrogance with, and I'm not accusing Dr. Watson of being that, I'm saying that perception they find in the United States government, right, is that, well, yeah, all right, you're really not that big a deal. I know, I got the nuclear weapons, yeah. It's all whatever. You're barely a regional power at best. Why don't you just accept your role? And that, you can hear it in what Lavrov said just last week, is that you're always sticking in our throat this idea that you won the Cold War. You won the Cold War. And apparently the only vision of post-Cold War is where we're the disregarded stepchild of world relations. That's the role you've envisioned for us. And we're telling you we don't accept that. We don't accept that for ourselves. And even worse is when they get into this sort of high-minded, and I've heard this in diplomatic conferences before, sort of like, it sounded like someone just criticized Russia for not being adventurous in its foreign policy. Well, clearly you're not a superpower. You didn't go around and screw around with everybody behind their back the way we did in the United States. Like, they're like, well, we think that means we're probably a good international neighbor. Now, of course, they're not in all things. But that sort of two-sidedness of the story confuses Russians to no end and makes them frustrated. So we've seen examples now where they thought they'd have an opportunity to create new relations with the United States, and the United States rebuffs them, for whatever reason. Sticking to old concepts and images that Russia doesn't really like and doesn't want, but they can't shed them because the United States controls the dialogue on the international stage. So that irritates them. Then getting accused of things that where they, in their own world, they would try to crow about that very fact as a positive, and you trot it out as a negative. Oh, it's so frustrating to Russians. So frustrating to Russians. Just completely.
It just occurred to me, along with this old Cold War rhetoric, how much of their perception of our view of them is based on our perception of Russia immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when it seemed to be a chaotic state, and the only thing you could rely on were the oligarchs.
Yeah, I've talked about this before in class where it said, I think, I hate when people do anything like to blame Hollywood for stuff. But in this particular case, I will say one horrific damage of American popular culture about Russia after the Cold War has been how just throughout the 90s, and it still happens today, but 90s was the heyday, and early 2000s was every mean SOB villain had to be what?
Russian.
Absolutely. And not like Russian, like Soviet general. No, this is some bad mother you know what coming from the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg, criminal organization, mafia, and all this other stuff, and quasi-terrorists. And it was scary.
You just had to be a boxer.
Scary stuff.
You.
You know, scary stuff. And so I have plenty of people. I have people still to this day will come up to me and they hear that my background deals fairly extensively with Russia originally. And they'll be like, oh, I could never go there. And I was like, well, why? And they're like, oh, it scares me. And they're not being a jerk about it. Like, they are legitimately scared about just going because their impression is as soon as I get off the plane, I know I'm going to get shot by some mafia guy.
And see,
because the movies tell me so.
That's kind of one of the points I'm trying to make in terms of, there's a lot of young people in here, and all I can tell you is take whatever media blitz you've experienced for the last 10 years relative to the war on terror and the threat of radical Islam and multiply it by 10, and that was the rhetoric of the Cold War. Okay? The only people in the movies that weren't getting blown away, besides the Russians, were aliens. Those were the bad guys. That was it. Well, and you can always kill Nazis for some reason.
In the very back, and I you have some questions.
Okay. Actually, I'll give my background. I came from Moscow in 1999. So.
I want to talk to you later.
Yeah, I wrote and we emailed each other actually. So my, you know, and I'm watching this Ukrainian thing on TV because I'm streaming Russian TV directly from Russia. So, and you of course completely opposite. And I know kind of my opinion on that Ukrainian thing is kind of let genie out of the bottle by supporting Crimean annexation, though it was completely justified because Crimea is a Russian territory.
Listen, people, listen, you're getting some real old homeschool stuff right here.
No, it's not.
Absolutely.
It's true. You know, the
No.
Russian czars were sending troops to get Crimea to be annexed to Russia.
Yeah, no,
if anybody should own Crimea, should be Greek people. Right, because this Medea and Golden Sheepskin, how do you call it?
The Golden Fleece.
Yes,
Yeah.
Golden Fleece is actually happening in Crimea. So there was the first colonies were Greek. Then it was taken out the Turkish.
It's going mythological.
So now that Tatar people think that they're native settlers in Crimea, which they're not.
I think that's I'm sorry, did I interrupt you? I think it's a really great point simply because it shows the difference of how there's a disconnect when the two nations, the United States and Russia, talk about things that are as much as we portray the Ukraine being a deep Russian interest, it's actually not, to me, a deep Russian interest, affairs in Ukraine. It's certainly not a deep American interest, or they would have done more, and they have not from the very beginning. But there's this example, I really like the comment about letting the genie out of the bottle. So it's sort of like, Putin is just like, I didn't do anything. And then, so his criticism is really, why didn't you stop the genie from coming out of the bottle? That's what the real criticism is of Russia when it comes to Ukraine, which we won't accept. It's not how much Russia has done that would be out of the ordinary and strange in this circumstance, but rather, why didn't you stop it and do it according to what we think is best for Ukraine? And Putin's reaction has been like, why would I do that? If that interest may be against my country's interest.
It's just my personal opinion. But in Crimea, unanimously voted for, of course, being part of Russia. Because if you come to Crimea, I used to take vacations like it's a beachfront, like you said. And it's a beautiful one. So when you come there, nobody speaks Ukrainian, though it was gifted to Ukraine in the 50s, I think, right?
Yeah.
It was, and you know what, when Stalin...
Did you say, I'm sorry, gifted?
Yeah, Khrushchev.
Like somebody just wrapped it and like...
Khrushchev gave it to
drawing borders between Ukraine and Russia. He literally put a ruler to the map and said, yeah, here will be the border. He didn't consider ethnical boundaries. He didn't consider any languages spoken.
There was...
And it was done, I think, on purpose. because he.
It was funny to me.
It was,
Like, Putin is not blameless. Putin is by no means not blameless.
It was done on purpose.
But there was, it
It
was,
would be difficult to separate after you draw the boundary, like in the middle of basically splitting two families on two sides of the border.
the one thing about the historical gifting, quote unquote, that is gone, you can, there was a meme that went around Russian internet for a while back in the early summer that basically split almost all of Ukraine into the different chronological gifts, in the sense of that the country exists the way it is in its present form, from, well, this was a gift from Peter the Great, this was a gift under Lenin, this was a gift under Stalin, this is a gift under Khrushchev. And Putin actually a few months back in an interview on Russian television was like saying, well, we understand that, Crimea was always a part of Russia until the 50s, until Khrushchev gave it to the Ukrainian Republic in the Soviet Union. Why the hell he did that, I have no idea. He literally said that in the interview. It was awesome because it was like this one little snippet of like, idiot Khrushchev kind of thing. It's like, but he wouldn't say it outright. But you could tell the dismissiveness. But the gifts have to be always with a grain of salt, because it's, listen, you can do whatever you want. The Soviets looked at the Soviet Union as their country. It wasn't Russia and then all the republics are their own countries as well. It was the Soviet Union. So if I gift something from technically as part of the Russian Federated Socialist Republic and give it to the Ukrainian public in the Soviet Union, who still controls it? Moscow still controls it in the end if it wants. It just, that little nasty thing in 1991 got in the way, where suddenly the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Now everyone became an independent country. Like, oh man.
You know what people said when Yeltsin came from signing those agreements? They said, why did you come back without Crimea?
Yeah.
That was the first question that he was asked.
Real quick.
Why did you sign it without saying Crimea belongs to Russia? Because everybody, like culturally, it truly is.
Real quick, just to make sure that we maintain the balance here. To be perfectly honest, if from the U.S. perspective we were just talking about the Ukraine and Crimea, okay, we might not have.
Hold on, because we have also.
We might not have the firm foundation for